Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. This video is going to contain an overview of new Wyrmprints that are now available by clearing Lilith's Encroaching shadow. There are 6 new Wyrmprints available in total, and they can be equipped in 6th and 7th Wyrmprint slots on light element Agito weapons. In this video, I'm going to talk about the build possibilities opened up by these new Wyrmprints, as well as a general priority order as far as which of them you should try obtain and invest in first. In case you didn't see it, last week I posted a couple boss breakdowns for the new Lilith fight on Expert and Master difficulty, so in those videos I talked mostly about the gameplay and mechanics of the fight, and this video is really going to be the context around the battle itself and how to spend your resources wisely once you are able to clear. So that's the plan for today. This is going to be a more casual, informal video. We're going to meander our way through some of these build ideas here. And on screen now, you can see I have Hildegard, who has been an absolute breakout star for this content. She is walking the catwalk today for us. She's going to be modeling some of our Wyrmprint sets in the Healer collection. And alongside her to help with Wyrmprint showcasing, I also have Mitsuhide on my team to show off some of the new possibilities for DPS. So let me swap Mitsuhide to Hildegard here, and before we really get into this, let's first take a look at the collection and just discuss and explain what all these new Wyrmprints do. So in case you're not aware, these Wyrmprints have lower might than every other Wyrmprint, so you can find them at the end here. And there are 6 in total, they're on screen now, but some of them do look pretty similar and even have the same name and artwork, yet they're not the same print. For example, Mask of Determination, there are 2 prints with this name. One of them has the Bow's Boon Affinity, the other has the Lance's Boon Affinity. One of them has Swords Psalm 3, the other has Critical Rate. So these are not the same Wyrmprint, but they can easily be confused, so be careful about that. And likewise here when it comes to the Her Beloved prints, one of them has the Sword's Boon Affinity and the other has the Crown's Boon Affinity. So they actually have the same ability. In this case, they're just at different levels of unbinds, that's why it has a different number at the end, but those actually do have the same ability, but different affinities. It's super confusing, I know. So there are only 6 Wyrmprints in total, and 2 of them come by playing the standard difficulty of Lilith. So that's going to be Crown of Light and Tutelary's Destiny. Both of those provide up to 20% skill damage when max unbound, but Tutelary's Destiny has the Wolf's Boon Affinity, which if you have 2 prints with that, it gives you 100% stun res, whereas Crown of Light has Serpent's Boon, which if you have 2 prints with that affinity, it gives you 100% curse res. And the other Wyrmprints, the other 4, come from the Expert and Master difficulties. So I think that the order you want to get these in is, I think that you want to start with Crown of Light and at least get one of those. That is helpful to max unbind, and the fact that you have the Serpent's Boon Affinity on it, it's really good for Julietta leads in auto battle of Experts. It's going to allow her to have curse res with a lot of flexibility in her 6th or 7th Wyrmprint slot. That's where I think you want to start. After that, I think that this Sword Psalm 3 on Mask of Determination, this mask with the Bow's Boon Affinity, is really, really good. And I think that's the one you want to go for next as far as max unbinding. And I actually think for that one you also want to obtain at least 3 copies, possibly 4. Now when it comes to the other Wyrmprints, they definitely have their applications. And Mask of Determination seems like possibly the next best Wyrmprint to get and max unbind. It just fits on to a lot of characters really well with the Critical Rate. The Lance's Boon Affinity boosts 4 strike damage, so that also works for some characters. And following that, I think you want to go for Her Beloved. Eventually, Tutelary's Destiny as well, and then the Her Beloved with the Crown's Boon Affinity I would place last, behind the one with the Sword's Boon Affinity. So I'll talk through some of the reasoning on this as we head over to the upgrade page, and then we'll talk about some of the builds that are enabled. But one thing to point out here is, I started by talking about the Wyrmprint ordering. Of course, none of these Wyrmprints are going to even do anything unless you actually go into your Agito weapons and unlock the 6th or 7th slots here. So do remember to do that first, because it'd be a shame to invest into the print, get all hyped up, and realize you can't even equip it yet because you haven't spent the resources to unlock these slots. So as far as what order to do those in, and which adventures are sort of best to use for Lilith as a whole, I think that Hildegard is such a staple in solo, auto, and co-op that she's a pretty safe bet as far as a first choice of which of these weapon types to unlock the slots on. A second choice for me would be the axe because of Julietta's role in auto battle, followed by the lance because usually you'll see a lance in auto battle teams, whether Rizarda or Xiao Wuxing, and Rizarda is also really good for co-op. And from there you can kind of branch out depending on what you prefer to do. Are you doing this more in co-op or solo? Which characters do you like to play as? You know, if you're going into co-op with the Mitsuhide, maybe you want to go for her. Maybe you're using Mordecai in your auto, so maybe you want to go for him. Or perhaps you're using Gala Yuden in co-op, maybe you want to go for that. There's really a lot of room here, and each weapon type has characters who are good. You know, when it comes to bows, perhaps you have Luca, and he could be good in co-op play. He could also be good in auto because of the Dispel, so he has some merits as well. Same thing with the wands. You know, Peony's pretty good for solo just by virtue of her co-ability, even though she's not a super high DPS. And when it comes to co-op, Amane's also a pretty good option for co-op. And then finally, for mana casters, you have characters like Ilya, who despite being sort of nerfed by Curse of Nihility, she's still pretty good. And Irene, despite just being sort of bad, she's still a Flashprint enabler, and is pretty fine as far as her attack range for things like auto and solo play. So yeah, you have a lot of flexibility. I think you want to start though with probably the staff, the axe, the lance to begin with, and then venture out depending on which adventures you use in particular. Of course, that probably should supersede even the axe, lance, staff advice if you really use a lot of different types of adventures than what I'm suggesting here. Alright, so that's the order as far as what weapons I think you want to prioritize. Now let's head into the upgrade page for the Wyrmprints because there's something else to point out here. So what I want to point out is that it actually costs more to max and bind a second print than it does to get an additional copy of a print that's already max and bound. So this is why I think that Tutelary's Destiny, I already max and bound it, but I don't think you should prioritize that. Because if you look here at Crown of Light, if you want to get an extra copy of Crown of Light, it costs 200 of this silver level material and 150 of this gold level material. But if you want to max and bind the other skill damage print from scratch, it costs more than this. It costs 350 and 250. So you could practically get two of these, you know, with 50 more in each category, you could practically get two copies of this first print around a similar cost. You know, it's a little more to get two copies, but around a similar cost to max and binding just one of Tutelary's Destiny. And for now, that stun res is not super relevant compared to the curse res. So that could be a way to power yourself up a little bit quicker is by going for the copies rather than going for max and binding a different print. And that also applies to her beloved here because as of now, this Crown's Boon Affinity, not really that useful still, but the Sword's Boon has become useful thanks to Sword Psalm. So this is one that if you have to choose between these, like I probably wouldn't touch this Crown's Boon one to max and bind it until I get copies on the Sword one. And that's even if I wanted multiple copies, which I don't think that one's a particularly high priority. The reason I think that Sword Psalm here is the highest priority as far as getting copies of is this effectively allows you to get a free extra 8% strength on a lot of your DPS adventurers. And now let's get into exactly how that works. So I'm on the teams page here, and I have Mitsuhide and Hildegard. We're going to start with Mitsuhide and talk about builds for DPS adventurers. So I want to start off by equipping her with a 5-print DPS setup. This is the typical type of setup you would have seen in the days of Tartarus's Wrath. And so, for example, what she has here is pretty standard. This is something that you would see relatively often with lots of different types of weapon types and characters. You want skill damage of 40% associated with that weapon type. You want Flurry Strength to max out strength at 20%, and since she's a dagger, she can actually utilize that pretty well. Paralyzed Punisher, because Tartarus could be paralyzed, Mitsuhide can cause paralysis. Frostbite Punisher, because Tartarus can be frostbitten, and even on Master difficulty, he can be frostbitten. That's one contrast with Poison. Otherwise, I would have Poison Punisher here, but on Master, Tartarus does start with 80% Poison res. and then a weapon-specific critical rate print, or if this were a character who didn't have that, just some type of generic critical rate print, or perhaps critical damage. In her case, she does have that since she's a dagger. This is what we were used to. What you're getting here is 40% skill damage. You're maxing out on it. You're maxing out on strength. You're getting a total of 40% Punisher, which you want to diversify the brackets your bonuses are in, so having Punisher is kind of nice here. And then you're getting 12% critical rate. Good enough. It worked well for Tartarus. Obviously, something like this wouldn't work super well for Lilith because she can't be frostbitten to the same degree as Tartarus, who has 0 res. But this is what you're used to. Now let me switch to my other equipment set for Mitsuhide here, which is the new 7 DPS print setup now that we have extra slots. So one thing I've changed is I'm no longer using Frostbite Punisher because, well, Flashburn Punisher is actually relevant now and it actually exists compared to when Tartarus came out. And for Lilith, it's pretty common to see Flashburn enablers like Ilya, like Rizarda, and even like Irene, now that there are at least 3 adventurers who do that. So I have changed that. But what you can see here is I still have my max amount of strength. I now have 45% Punisher instead of 40%, in part because I was able to use a 5-star slot here for the Flashburn Punisher. I have my dagger critical rate, and then the way that I use these additional slots is there's a 4-star print with the Sword Spoon affinity. It's called a small, let's see if we can click on it. It's called a Small Courage. I was going to say a Small Hope, but it's Hope on the artwork. That provides 20% skill damage in the Sword Spoon affinity. Then you can get your other 20% skill damage from either the Tutelary print or Crown of Light. That's going to max you out at 40%, so you're still maxing out on that. And then you can use this new print, Sword Psalm, which makes it so that instead of needing 4 print slots to get the Sword Spoon affinity 8% strength bonus, it reduces that by 3, so you only need 1 print with the sword effect here, and you get this 8%, which doesn't cap out with like the flurry strength that you have. So that's just an extra free 8%. Compared to that previous build that I just showed, this is definitely better. Not only are you getting extra stats from just having extra Wyrmprints, but basically you're getting, in this case, more Affliction Punisher, but that's just because we changed the type of Punisher here. But most importantly, you're getting 8% extra strength in addition to just stats because you have augments on these. So I think this is really a go-to for a lot of DPS characters now looking at Lilith. One thing that might differ from character to character is, not all characters are going to have a 4-star weapon print. Basically, it's Menacasters and daggers that have that. So, if you weren't using a dagger, let's say, let's swap to icons here. And we'll scroll up to see some of the higher might prints, but if you wanted to just use any type of weapon, you could use something like this for 8% critical rate. You could use critical damage, maybe 4-strike damage, depending on what the character you're using actually wants to do. But this has a lot of flexibility here, and so now to switch over to show another possibility for 7 Wyrmprints, let's look at a variant here. And this would be, let's say you go back to Tartarus, you have a Rizarda in your team, you still have a Frostbite shared skill. All of a sudden, you can even do some more explosive things if you use this new Forbidden Corrosion print. So the risk with this is that it debuffs you, and in case you were confused by this, at level 3, you get 15% HP and strength, and that debuff with damage over time that increases as time goes on. At level 2, which is 2 unbinds, you just get the strength buff and the debuff. And at level 1, you just get the debuff, which is 0 unbind. So if you're wondering, why do I want a print that just debuffs me? As you unbind it, it gets better. The thing about this, though, is that this shares a cap with stuff like Flurry Strength, and the HP shares a cap with stuff like Study Rabbits. So this isn't its own exclusive ability or extra stats that stack on top of those. So that does make it a lot worse than I first thought. But this is also a sword affinity here, so this combos with the Sword Psalm as well. So I'm still getting 8% strength. Now I'm only getting 15% regular strength instead of the 20% off Flurry, but I don't have to even maintain a combo if I don't want to. And what I've done is basically shift that over into now I have 65% in the Punisher bracket. and I've only gone down by 5% in the strength bracket. Let's say I'm running Daikokuten. Daikokuten's an 80% strength dragon with flurry strength 20%, that would have been 100. All that switching this on did was drop that to 95, and then I guess plus 8 because of this to both of them, so that doesn't change. So instead of basically stacking in strength, I've gone for more Affliction Punisher. You can do a triple Punisher setup, and that is potentially viable now with something like this. Maybe not that realistic, because you do need to heal off this corrosion debuff, and by heal off I mean like consistently heal it off, because you can't remove it even by healing a large amount, so that is something to be aware of. The Wyrmprint version of this, you can't remove it. But basically, there are a lot of high DPS potential print setups now that didn't really exist in the past. To be clear, I think that the typical one you're going to see often is something like this. And for solo play, this is why I think that you want copies of this Sword Psalm print. You want to be able to put 8% extra strength on any of your DPS characters on your team by splitting their 40% skill damage print into 2 slots here and then comboing with this. I think that's going to be preferred for most DPS adventures that you're running these days. So that's the take for DPS as far as how to use these prints. Now let's move on to Hildegard and talk about healers here. So let's start off again with what were we typically seeing in the past. So I think I have five print setup on here. And this is sort of my stock setup for healers, supporters. It basically just accumulates a lot of buff time, has some recovery potency, a little bit of force charge for some emergency safety. These are often the types of Wyrmprints you would see, if not skill haste, but when it came to skill haste, it was sort of hard to get a lot of Bow's Boon affinity because you need quite a bit before to even activate it. So you need 3 slots on that to get 6%, and then if you have 4 slots, you get 10%. Well, now that we have extra slots for healers, if we go back to our Wyrmprint sets for Hildegard here, let's look at one variant, and we're going to move some prints over from Mitsuhide. You could do something like this. So this is using that Sword's Palm again with the Forbidden Corrosion. So that's already going to give you 15% HP and strength, but damage over time. That's less of a drawback on a healer because they can actually heal it off. Now in Tartarus, there's other mechanics, to be fair, that prevent healing, so be careful about that. But that's already strength and HP, which you may not even be able to slot into a healer normally because they want their slots for so many other things. And then this also gives you Bow's Boon affinity, which is going to allow you to get 10% skill haste by using some other prints with that same affinity. And so what I've chosen to use is recovery potency 8%, skill haste 6%, skill haste 8%, this together is 14. This 8% recovery potency added with this 13%, it caps at 20. And then finally, you even have a flex slot. So this flex slot I used for extra buff skill time to give an extra regen tick on regen, add some buff time to that. And this is with an extra 10% skill haste on top, with an extra 8% strength on top. This seems a lot better than some of what we've been able to achieve with healers in the past. You know, you're almost maxing out on skill haste. You're almost maxing out, or you are maxing out on recovery potency. You're 15 out of 20 on strength. You're 15 out of 15 on HP. There's a lot of good stuff here. 20 out of 30 on buff time. You're able to maximize a lot of different dimensions at the same time. Now to show a few variants on that, you know, basically I left everything the same except the first 5-star print that was sort of a flex slot. So, you know, if you wanted extra buff time for an extra regen tick, you could do that. If you wanted force charge for emergency healing, you could do that. Another option you could do is do this strength debuff, where you lose a little bit of strength, but you can also debuff the enemy strength with standard attacks. So you have the room to mix things up with a kit like this. And one of the coolest aspects of this as well is that these weapons can be equipped off element and you still get the extra Wyrmprint slots. Now eventually that probably won't be a problem because we'll have every element Agito weapon with extra Wyrmprint slots, but for now, you could actually use this light staff on, let's say, your water healer for the second half of Master Tartarus's fight, and it would give her potentially more skill haste or more recovery potency at the cost of stats, which, to be fair, is a pretty big trade-off. So it's something to consider. I've definitely messed around with that with water characters who aren't running shared skills, they're going to have that Agito skill, but Agito skills aren't particularly good against Lilith because she has Nihility to get rid of debuffs. So you could actually slap on light element Agito weapons off element. That'll prevent them from toggling their Agito skill on and off and wasting time, and also open up 2 additional Wyrmprint slots that those characters wouldn't have had otherwise. Just some food for thoughts. Eventually, we're going to hopefully be able to have extra slots on every element Agito weapon. But as things are, there's still a lot of cool possibilities here, I feel. So hopefully this has been helpful as just a way of breaking down what some of these new Wyrmprints can do. That is pretty much going to do it for today, everyone. So let me know how you're using these Wyrmprints in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you as always for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.